Hello, Bonsai friends. This is Evan of Underhill Bonsai, and welcome to episode 17 of Little Things for Bonsai People podcast, formerly Bonsai Southeast. And today I am joined by Mike Lane of Kitsune Bonsai. How you doing today, Mike?
Good. How are you guys?
Awesome. And then unfortunately, Carmen couldn't join us today, but we'll catch up with her on a later episode. She's busy in the bonsai garden with Michael. So today we're going to have a very special episode. We have a guest with us. We have Mr. David De Groot. He's going to be talking to us about bonsai curation, how he got into bonsai, and everything that he loves about bonsai. So we're looking forward to talking to him today. But before we get started, I do need to mention that our podcast is sponsored by Underhill Bonsai, Louisiana's premier bonsai nursery. If you'd like to support our show, you can follow, like, subscribe on our social media accounts as followed. For Underhill, we have a Facebook and Instagram. You can also go to our website and sign up at underhillbonsai.com for our newsletter. For Mike, it's Kitsune Bonsai. He has a Facebook and an Instagram under the same name. Mike also has merch available on his website, kitsunebonsai.com. And that class that's coming up, that's still, what was the date on that, Mike?
That'll be this Saturday. We have a Zoom class, beginner Zoom class, basically just going over the fundamentals. A lot of the fundamentals that probably our guest speaker wrote. And so we'll be going over a lot of those fundamentals. For a $20 fee. It'll just be about a 3-hour Zoom class. So grab a cup of coffee, and join us for a nice morning.
Yeah, you don't even need a computer. You can just have a cell phone to attend that. That's it's only $20.
So you'll be sitting on the beach.
Yeah, you can blur the background. Nobody needs to know where you're at. And for Carmen, you can follow her Instagram, which is going to be Becoming Bonsai. And then she's also the co-founder of Purple Pot Society. So you can go to purplepotsociety.org for more information. You can become a member. It's not gender specific. You can be any gender and support the National Women's Bonsai Club. We do have a new Patreon I need to do a shout out for today. We have Vicky Auth. Thank you so much for becoming a bonsai bud and supporting our show. You are awesome. Anyone else that's interested in supporting us financially, go over to Patreon/Little Things for Bonsai People and become a bonsai bud for $1. Just that $1 goes a long way.
Yeah, I actually know Vicky. Hi, Vicky.
Awesome. I'm glad she's somebody that you work with and in bonsai. And then the podcast has merch now, so we have a few t-shirt designs that are going to be available on Mike's website for now until we can find another way to kind of switch over and get a website for the podcast up and going. But we have designs for Little Things for Bonsai People t-shirts with our logo and featured designs from graphic designers and other artist friends of ours. You can go check those out over at kitsunebonsai.com. So let's go ahead and start talking about our guest. So I'm going to introduce Mr. David De Groot. He's former curator of the Pacific Bonsai Museum or the Pacific Rim Bonsai Collection in Federal Way, Washington. And he's also a former percussionist of the New Orleans Symphony Orchestra. That kind of hits home a little bit because I'm in Louisiana and very familiar with New Orleans. He is also the author of an amazing and very informative book titled Principles of Bonsai Design, which has also gotten a reprinting. You can go pick it up at stonelantern.com and we can see what other places it'd be available as well. But that's where I've seen it currently. And Mr. De Groot is also very active in bonsai. You can see him judging at shows, or giving bonsai demonstrations and conducting workshops around the U.S. So I've seen a good bit of his work on Facebook, and I was wondering where else can people see examples of your work, Mr. De Groot?
Well, I think Dave suits me well. Mr. De Groot was my dad, and
you got it, Dave.
So anyway,
I was just being very formal.
Thank you for being so courteous. That's that Southern courtesy that I'm hearing, and I appreciate it. Yeah. So basically, because I'm not into merchandising and I'm not into any kind of, I don't have anything to sell. It's just, I teach basically. And so I don't even actually sell my own books. So in other words, you can't get them from me. You can get them from Stone Lantern. So my career after leaving the Pacific Bonsai Museum is solely in education, solely in teaching. And so you can find me basically on Facebook.
Yeah. There's a lot of great stuff that you've posted on there. A lot of your awesome trees in your personal collection, things that you've been doing with demonstrations and instruction. Where do you instruct at? Where are you spending a lot of your time doing that?
Well, okay, so I do some traveling, and for instance, I locally I do a number of local bonsai clubs, not on a regular basis, but kind of as invited. And so that's Puget Sound Bonsai Association is one. The Olympia Bonsai Club, Olympia is not too far away from here. And I'll be going down to California later this year. I'll be going to actually going to New Zealand later this year.
Wow, that's
a couple
cool.
months.
That's awesome.
And I've been to China 3 times giving demonstrations there. I'll be in Canada, in Winnipeg later this year for demonstrations. So in other words, I do some traveling, and I really like working on my trees. That's fun. I have friends who come over and work with me, and I really enjoy that a lot. I do some classes at Asia Pacific Gardening, which is a local Chinese import place. And they offer regular classes for beginners. And then I do occasional classes for not beginners. And so anyway, there are a few outlets. But I've been retired from the Pacific Bonsai Museum now for 8 years. And so I'm doing what I like, which is working on my trees and doing some teaching.
Yeah,
and
of course,
putting out the second edition of my book, which was a lot of fun.
Awesome.
So what, David, is your favorite aspect of bonsai to teach?
Well, the favorite aspect is basically design. My book is on design. And I like to approach it not from the angle of my teacher told me to do this, but because I've had 50 years of experience in bonsai and been with various teachers and so forth, and have a lot of my own experience. I like to approach it as simply as art. You could be doing a painting, you could be doing a sculpture with stone or metal or whatever. And for bonsai, the same kind of conditions apply, or the same kind of principles apply. And so that's why in my book, I focus on, it's called Principles of Bonsai Design. And I use 3 principles of art. And if you look in various art textbooks, you'll find anywhere between 7 or 10 principles. And principles are like, they're not rules, because in bonsai, there's so much concern about terms we use. Okay. Not so much today as in earlier years, but there was this whole thing about rules. And my comment has always been, rules in art are descriptions of common practice.
Right.
They're not legislation. They're not, nobody cares about that. But for instance, I focus on things like proportion, balance, and harmony in the design. And I think those 3 elements or principles can be extracted from all the other principles that art text writers use, because many of the principles in our textbooks are repetitive or they overlap. And I've distilled it down to these 3. Nice. And so that's how I like to approach bonsai. And that's how I like to approach if I'm judging. an exhibit, for instance. That's how I want to approach it. And then layered on those three principles are what I call the three biases. And the three biases are cultural. What comes from the culture? Is it Japanese style? Is it Chinese style? Did it come from that culture? Is it, the style has to do with everything from, or I shouldn't call it style. That's a wrong thing to say. I should really say that it's part of the culture from which it came. Really, culture is a better word than style. So that has to do with architecture of an area. It has to do with clothing, language, art, so on. So the cultural bias is something that gets layered on top of those three artistic principles, the universals. And then on top of that, you get what I call fashion. That's temporary. And that has to do with, I want to be in group. I want to be doing what I see my colleagues doing and showing that I, am part of this group or this generation, or that I'm in the know, and so on. So I want to be in fashion. And then the last bias is the personal bias. It's like my personal taste. You like green, I like red. And not one is right or wrong. It's just that we have different things that are our priorities. And so I use those three principles and three biases when I talk about bonsai always. And you can just use that anywhere.
I love it. Could I ask one question? What is probably, and this is a hard question to ask, what do you think are some of the things that are currently in fashion right now in bonsai that you see?
Well, the thing that is very much in fashion right now is the extended branch. So in other words, one long branch, the first branch typically that's on the same side as the lean. That's something that is not, if you would go back 20, 30 years, you would have a counterbalancing branch. In other words, the main lowest branch would be on the side of the tree opposite the lean. And what that does is it affects the balance. So in one case, I say that when it's opposite the lean, it tends to stabilize the composition. And so that's stable balance. When it's in the direction of the lean, it's not so stable, it's more directional. And therefore, I would call that it's more of a dynamic balance. And in some cases, it also requires the container. It's not just the tree in itself that's balancing, but certainly the visual mass of the container comes into play.
Right. And also, I guess, the positioning of that elongated branch, whether that's going to go over the negative space and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the other thing is now, since importing trees became so hard about what is it now? Between 15, 20 years ago, when a lot of the rules were changed, that we turned to starting to use our native trees. And of course, especially here in the West, the use of native trees almost always involves specimens that are taken from the dry side of the mountains, specimens that have been naturally dwarfed and have been exposed to extremes of natural conditions. And so deadwood, especially with the junipers that are very popular, deadwood as a feature, as an important feature, is very typical now of what I see as being popular in bonsai.
That's interesting.
We had talked about doing Yamadori in a very soon to come episode, and we did touch on deadwood quality and stuff like that. We're seeing a lot more deadwood, and especially in the U.S. right now, with all the collecting the Cascades and the Rocky Mountains and all that. We're seeing some really awesome Rocky Mountain junipers and other high quality, like the 1C junipers, some really high quality stuff coming out. So yeah, can definitely see that coming in.
You see it in Europe too. They're collecting, out of the Alps. And you see a tremendous amount tremendous number of trees with the native pines and junipers that have significant amounts of deadwood on them.
Even some of a lot of the olives I see that, they're doing in Italy and whatnot are, hundreds plus year old trees that they're digging up with very, very cool, old, long lasting deadwood. So.
Yeah, and in China for many years, they have been using deadwood as significant elements, sometimes not so much protruding branches, jin branches, that sort of thing, so much as knot holes right. in wood and hollowed out trunks, decaying trunks. I have a Chinese elm that I've been working on for a number of years that I carved deeply into it to make deep knot holes in it, and deliberately have never tried to preserve anything because my idea is to let it go ahead and rot out, because that's again the concept of trying to project the image of age.
Right. That's interesting. So one of the things I do, David, and I'm hoping you're in a similar mindset, sounds like you are, is I tend to grow things. I don't just grow things by the Japanese paradigm. I like to learn about the Chinese way of growing things. And I like to grow certain trees under certain paradigms. And I like to explore different cultural outlooks in bonsai. So like one of the things that I'm dying to ask you about is your right angle tree. Yeah. Yeah.
That was a sort of an accident. When I bought that tree, it was in a sales lot at a nursery. I was returning from Portland and stopped at a nursery, and they had a bunch of hinoki kind of roped off, and they were balled and burlapped and then stuck in big nursery containers. And I could see a tiny bit of the bottom of the trunk. This thing was thickly foliated. I could see a tiny bit of the bottom of the trunk, and it appeared to be straight. And I thought, well, you know what? It's a substantial size tree. It looks like it has I don't really have any significant formal upright trees in my collection. And this is going to be my formal upright. And then I took it home and I started taking the burlap off and discovered that, the trunk keeps going and it's not straight anymore. As we so often learn when we get a tree and start digging into the container. Yeah. So there goes that out the window. So it wasn't going to be a formal upright from that perspective. And then as I started removing branches, I discovered a total right angle bend. Somebody had just lopped the trunk off at one time, and a horizontal branch had taken over. And as it grew out to the side, apparently in the nursery, they decided, well, they didn't want that either. So they lopped that horizontal branch off and let it start growing up. And so when I bought the tree, there were two right angles in it. And it sat in my driveway for a couple of months while I tried to decide what to do with it. And finally, because I've made several trips over to China and I've seen some very large exhibits and so forth, and I'd seen right angle bonsai in which right angles are used. They're called square turnstile. And typically you don't see that throughout the tree. You'll see that on a couple primary branches, but it's not repeated endlessly. But anyway, I looked at this thing, and I've always been of the opinion that since bonsai are abstract compositions anyway, there'd be no harm in carrying that out to be fully abstract. So I took what the tree gave me. I took what I had seen in China, and I took the idea of extending the concept of abstraction. I put them all together and came up with that.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. No, that's really cool, because I think it's a useful technique to kind of, like you said, pull from all these different elements. Like, to me, it being too rigid limits your toolkit. You know, so it limits your toolkit. And when you're approached with something like a right angle tree, a lot of people who are too rigid might give up on it or trade it out or something like that. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah.
I'm going to have to use the image of the right angle tree as either the cover
thumbnail.
for the thumbnail of this episode, so everybody can see it. But you can go back on Dave's Facebook a little ways. It was displayed.
Excuse me. Bonsai Empire did a thing on it when my trees were at a retrospective show this past summer at the Pacific Bonsai Museum.
Yeah.
Okay. So
they've
Bonsai Empire has some pictures. You can find it there.
Very cool.
I'll drop a link in the description for that. Awesome.
Okay.
Very
Great.
Good.
But yeah. So tell us about being a curator over at the Pacific Bonsai Museum, or formerly the Pacific Rim.
Right. So my situation was that I had been a percussionist with the New Orleans Symphony until they started having financial problems. And when I started seeing the late paychecks and missed paychecks and so on, I didn't resign, but I took leave of absence, an extended leave of absence. And I was already teaching part-time at Loyola University in the music department, and I was doing pickup jobs, freelance jobs. But there was a very active bonsai community in New Orleans, and I had been at this for about 17 years at that time, and was doing a lot of teaching and writing and so forth already. And so I started. I went into business during my day job, became taking care, managing other people's collections. And so I was able to find a good amount of work doing that. And that went on for a couple of years. And then one day I saw a flyer that came out from the American Bonsai Society with an ad for the curator job out here in Washington State. And for me, it was a lark. I just said, hey, got nothing to lose. What the heck? So I sent some material in, and to my surprise, I got a phone call and got a phone interview. And after that, they flew 3 other people and myself out there for interviews on site. And so then I was, I thought, very fortunate to get that position. And when I started, the facility was still under construction. So all of the walls, the alcoves that you see, there were only concrete foundations. And so the committee that was charged with assembling a collection, which had been active since the previous May. I came out in August. They had assembled 52 trees that lived in a chain link fence enclosure at the technology center. And so initially I cared for the trees there until in October the collection opened. And we moved everything over to the display area. But there was nothing there. So part of my job was we didn't even know, for instance, we didn't know if it was going to be open all year or just part of the year. There wasn't really a plan.
Right.
This was Weyerhaeuser Company did this because it was a way to recognize their trade relationships with their Asian partners, because they did a lot of business in Asia. Especially in Japan, but in China and other places too. And as a way of saying, we recognize some aspect of your art and culture that also has to do with trees, which is what we're involved in.
Right.
So that was part of it. Part of it was to have a cultural resource for the people of the community. It was always intended to be free. It was never intended to have an admission fee. And so it was put together with those concepts in place, but not a real concept of what it takes to actually maintain a bonsai collection. So, for instance, there was a couple years, well, we didn't have winter enclosures the first year. Winter, I made styrofoam boxes that I put over the trees, put them on the ground. And by the second year, we had the winter enclosures that you see now in pictures. We built a growing area, a reserve area with a shade structure and 2 greenhouses and so forth, and built a potting shed and so on. Those all came after. So part of the early years was actually not only caring for the trees, but actually creating the necessary infrastructure to have a viable bonsai collection and a public facility like that. So that consumed a lot of time. And then I set about building the collection by adding to it. And part of what I chose to do was to go to originally the only non-US trees. There were Japanese trees that had come to us through US owners, not directly from Japan. But I set about getting trees from Japan and directly from mainland China, not just Taiwan. We had Taiwanese trees, but from mainland China and from Korea. And so we actually, part of what I wanted to do was actually represent the Pacific Rim, the countries of the Pacific Rim with which we dealt and where bonsai was important. So building the collection was part of some of the kind of middle years, I would say.
Awesome.
I have a question about that, David. I've been doing a little bit of maintenance at a very small kind of botanical garden that has a small bonsai exhibit. And one of the things that they have difficulty with is what do you do? How do you keep trees in an exhibit on display while still doing the necessary maintenance and keeping them healthy? Like, do you cycle them out with other trees and have like an area where there's maybe trees that are under maintenance?
Yeah, well, the ideally you would have at least 3 times as many trees in the collection as there are on display at any one time.
Very
so
good.
If you have 50 trees on display, you want to have 150 trees.
Gotcha.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what you have to do is to simply try to turn it into an educational opportunity and show that tree with the work being done and say, here's what you're seeing, here's what we're doing, and here's why we're doing this. This tree looks really overgrown and out of shape, but we're building energy for next year at some point, especially with junipers, especially with the junipers with expanded needles like the San Jose's and some of those things. You can't just keep pruning them back to ideal all the time, or eventually twigs just start to die. They give up. And so at some point you've got to let these things run and just build up some energy so that you can come in and then you sort of start over to a certain extent. But if you don't let them, there are certain trees that, and certain trees get sick. I mean, certain trees get disease problems. You're going to have trees that suffer from maybe an exceedingly hot weather. We had what we call a heat dome here last summer that I've never seen in my whole 33 years here. We had our back patio was 107 degrees. We never saw that before, And so I had some leaf burn. Luckily, that was the extent of it. Other people lost trees. And so, you get, and I know at the Bonsai Museum, they had a little bit of damage on a couple of the trees just because you can't control the heat,
Right.
For winter, you can put them into a greenhouse if you have one, which they do, which I do. But you can't do anything about the heat.
No.
Yeah, it's all
shade house and, but I mean, there's not much you can do.
Mentioning the heat stress, I did see they had I can't remember the exact species of beech. I think it's a Japanese beech.
Oh, there's a Japanese beach. Yeah, it's Fujibuna. So it's from the foothills of Mount Fuji.
That one had to be potted into a wooden box. I saw that recently. From the stress.
Aaron, who is doing a fantastic job there, by the way. I have to say this. I'm so pleased with how the collection looks and what's happening. And part of that is just strengthening the trees. When the trees have had some really stressful experiences and you say, whoa, I don't think, I'm a little worried I could lose branches. I just have to give them a little better environment for a while. So, and Aaron and he put those on display and it said, here they are. They're in a box because here's what we're doing. That's kind of like what I was talking about and saying, let that be seen. Let that be an educational moment.
Yeah, and that is the art. Sorry, Evan, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Nah, that happens all the time.
that is the argument, though, that some of the people who are maintaining the exhibit when I'm not there or not doing the seasonal work, they basically say that people the property wants the trees looking show ready all the time. They want to have that display. So the argument's always been like, can we turn it into an educational opportunity? And I think I've always thought, display it, show people the reality, don't sell them a bill of goods. And then when they get into it, you tell them the truth,
So that's right. It's like saying, oh yeah, you can grow this indoors.
Right.
And then you can't. I mean, maybe even if it's, I don't know, even a lot of tropicals don't fare well indoors, if they're looking for sun.
No, it's never as good.
Yeah. But at the Pacific Bonsai Museum during my visit, that was one of the things, really glad you brought it up about saying how there's periods of time when the trees need relief or they're shown in different developmental stages. I noticed that when I was there. And I went during the World War II exhibit that was put on. That was a beautiful display.
Fantastic.
Yeah, very cool.
When they put the Domoda maple in the wooden box to mock up what it would have been like waiting for its owners, that really connected with me. I think I'll always remember that because that's the side of bonsai that they don't get to see very often. And then there was a couple other trees there that were very interesting that I remember seeing. Like you had mentioned, different stages of development for that learning opportunity. There was a Yamadori that Dan Robinson had collected. Yeah, Dan Robinson. Yeah, I think it was a cedar, and it was just hanging out. It was really shaggy. It was in a wooden box, and I was like, I've never seen this before in a bonsai collection, just out on display.
I don't know that that's a permanent. I'm not sure that's part of the permanent collection. I
think it might have just been for the World War II.
Sure. Might have, yeah. But there's another thing is how you approach this. So, for instance, now that you brought Dan up, Dan relishes the idea of age in trees. I mean, he calls 100-year-old trees baby trees.
Right.
Because they're still our 100-year-old Douglas firs or our cedars, they're still cones.
Right.
They're still a pyramid, with a point. And he calls those baby trees, and he says, nah, that's not what he's interested in. He's interested in the 2,000-year-old trees, not the 100-year-old trees. And and part of that is that he has. So, Michael, this is like a polar opposite approach where I've been out there and where he's got trees where he lost a branch and it's on display. And I said, I probably would have taken that off display if it was at the museum. And he said, you know what? He said, trees die. He said, nature, this is what happens in nature. Branches die, trees die. He through his carving and work, tries to make trees look like they're in the process, in this of advanced age. And so he has a much more relaxed view about what you can show, but that's particular style. That's the gnarly, gnarly style, you know. So if you're in a botanical garden where everything is pristine, I understand that they're going to want every part of their garden to look pristine, but then the reality has to be you're going to have enough trees to cycle.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, going to have enough trees to cycle. So that's something that would be the hard truth that they would have to face if they in fact demand that. So the other thing is that when you have a multitude of people and many bonsai collections are primarily volunteer run. So in fact, down in Oakland, they've got a bonsai collection, a very good bonsai collection, the Lake Merritt collection that's all volunteer run, for instance. But what happens with that is you've got numerous people putting their hands on a tree and making certain decisions about a tree. And it's very hard to, I don't want to use the word enforce, but it's very hard to lay out a design or a concept or an approach that everybody is going to use, because everybody has their own idea, especially if they're experienced. You know, one of the things I find in workshops, for instance, if I have volunteers in a workshop, assistants, you know, it's one of the things that's really hard to get is somebody who will actually have the skill to really help the people with their trees, but who isn't going to redesign the tree before the next time I get back.
Right. Yeah.
Because usually, you know, when people get to a certain stage of accomplishment, of skill, they start wanting, they have an idea. You can't help having an idea and say, well, yeah, that looks nice, but you know, I would probably just do this instead. And so that happens with volunteers.
Yeah.
I remember in the early days, I had a volunteer who tried to restyle the trees every time she came out. And I had to really watch her, you know. So that's part of it. And that's part of the idea of having volunteers who are wonderful, and make no mistake, who are wonderful and essential, but it's like a workforce that they're still, in a way, they're staff. They're volunteer staff, but they're still staff, and they need direction, and they have to be people who are willing to accept direction. So
it's funny that you say that, Dave, because I have a buddy studying in Japan, and one of the things he had mentioned was that when he was applying for the apprenticeship, he was almost overlooked because of his age and experience. And they basically was told that they prefer people with no experience.
Yeah.
They want
blank
people
slate.
Blank slate. They don't want to have to break down that swing. They don't want to have to, you know, refill your cup. You know, if your cup's already full, you can't learn anything else. So it's so I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, but I think it's very true. Very true. Yeah. I remember even my days way back when I was teaching percussion, I would get freshmen coming in who had studied with their band director or their teacher, whoever it was. And that was the only experience they had had in their musical life. With this one person, and therefore, when all your information comes from one source, you know, they become a sort of a god,
right?
And then sometimes it would be very difficult with some people to say, you know, there's another way of doing this, and they would be, no, if it's not the way my teacher did it, it's wrong. Right. There's not just two ways of doing it. There are not two right ways of doing it. there's the right way and then there's the wrong way, and so that kind of thing, as you mentioned, like with the Japanese professionals, I absolutely understand that. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I get it. I do. I understand that.
So, having curated over at the Pacific Rim or Pacific Bonsai Museum over time, one of the questions we had prepared for you was, how do you think your practice has changed before and then through? How do you approach trees now? You feel like that's changed a significant amount? I know it's a broad question.
Well, I think there's absolutely a way that it's changed. So first of all, my bonsai education was, in fact, a lot of it came after I got that job, because then I started going to Japan so I would say, number one, that one of the things that's really important that changes you is to see really professional work. If all you've ever done is be in a bonsai club with fellow bonsai club members, and of course now the internet has changed everything, because now you do see everything. But it used to be that, especially if you didn't get to go to Japan, let's say, and see absolutely top quality professional work, you just wouldn't have an idea of what that could look like, what that could be. What could this bonsai be? Your image would always be that it would be something with a 1-inch diameter trunk that you got at a nursery in a 1-gallon pot, or something like that, And it wasn't until now there are so many bonsai professionals in the United States who have either studied in Japan or have studied with other bonsai professionals here who have studied in Japan, and who have the advantage of being able to travel and see what's being done internationally. And it changes your perspective on what bonsai can and should be. The other thing is working with very good quality big material. Is even nowadays what I have in my collection I call my backyard bonsai. These are my hobby trees. A lot of these are trees from New Orleans still,
Yeah.
These are my
Those
hobby.
are my favorite kinds.
Some of these, I even have, in fact, one of my trees I just posted on my Facebook page a few weeks ago, a little Mugo pine that I in fact bought at a hardware store for $2.50. It wasn't a gallon pot, And so one of the things it's like where you go and you really see professional work and you start to understand what your criteria should be or what your image should be. That makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, yeah. So is there a tree that you happen to have an affinity for, some material that would happen to be your favorite?
I
know that's always tough. It'd be tough for me to narrow it down, but
yeah.
I have to say, even though we're sort of at the northern edge of their range, or what they're like, I really like black pines.
Yeah.
I love black pines.
Me too.
And they're so frustrating because year to year, our weather patterns are so different that the candle cutting and the regrowth is wildly inconsistent from year to year because one summer we'll have no spring at all, and cold nights throughout the summer. It never, every overnight low in July is in the 50s, low 50s.
Oh,
Right.
wow.
And then another year, spring will start in April, and we'll hit 90 degrees 8 times or something during the year, and it'll be sunny, and then the growth is much faster. And so if you're shooting, as in Japan, where it's much more consistent, if you go in there in the first week in July and you cut the candles, you know what to expect and so on. So for us, at least for me, I never know what to expect. But I still love black pines. The other one that I really enjoy working with because they're so adaptable and because they'll take any amount of abuse, I guess, Chinese elms.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Chinese elms.
Heck yeah.
I think that's a really underutilized species for sure.
The humble,
And
humble Chinese elm.
I would love, as one of my favorites, would be Shimpaku, except that I had twig blight introduced into my environment several years ago. And so I have to really struggle with the junipers that have oppressed foliage.
Yeah.
So for instance, things like procumbens, or like I mentioned earlier, with the expanded foliage, like the procumbens or the San Jose's or something like that, they're not bothered. But Rocky Mountain junipers get hit really hard. Sierra junipers get hit. Shimpakus get hit, not as bad, but so in some cases, there are many people right in my immediate area who have not had it introduced, and who are very successful growing them. But they're beautiful trees, and I would love to. My wish list would be that I could count on not spending most of my time with my junipers trying to keep it alive.
Yeah, that's kind of our problem down here in Florida with, like what you said, similar to black pine issues, is we never know when we're going to get our first frost. If we even get a frost. So when do you start your decandling? And then with the junipers, we tend to be a very moist, humid climate, and those very dense junipers, they tend to suffer a lot of fungus issues.
Yeah.
So it's been a struggle to grow those, but still love them.
But when I advise people who are starting out and they ask me what kind of tree should I get, the 2 trees that I recommend most often are Shimpaku and Chinese elms.
Yeah.
Shimpaku, they don't care how cold it gets, it seems. They don't seem to care how hot it gets. They withstand drought. They can take shade as well as sun, not deep shade, but they can take a wide range of light conditions. They can take a wide range of temperature conditions, a wide range of moisture conditions. And those are 2 species that I as I said, I recommend them for beginners because the foliage is naturally small, and except for me, I mean, most people have a hard time killing them.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is important for somebody getting started, not to get discouraged, to work with something that won't get them discouraged.
Absolutely.
Speaking of beginners material that you just mentioned, one of the questions we had for you is, what's your best advice you could give to somebody who is a fresh beginner in bonsai? Just they're looking at material now and they're considering.
You mean the advice you're asking me about is how to select material? Is that what you're asking me?
No, I meant
what restate the question.
So they're standing at the forefront of bonsai. They're about to get into it. What's the best advice, your best wisdom you think you could give somebody that's getting into bonsai?
Okay. So first of all, bonsai, your medium as a sculptor, your medium is a living plant. And so your first job is to keep it alive.
Mm.
So the first job you have is to find out what it is. So many people show up with a bonsai, or used to show up when I was at the museum and I was giving these weekend demonstrations, and they come in, or I'll get phone calls. Oh, I've got this little bonsai and I think it might be sick. Well, what is it? Oh, I don't know. Yeah, they don't know what it is. They have no idea how to care for it. So I think the first thing I would impress on them is that, okay, you've got a living thing in your care. This is never going to be a good, it's never going to be a bonsai, let alone anything beautiful, if it's not healthy. If you don't know, if the horticulture has to come before the art.
Yep.
It's got to come before the art. You got to know how to keep it alive. You've got to know how to keep it healthy. And once you know what you've got, once you know what your conditions are, once you know, have some idea of how to care for this thing, then you can start talking about, okay, now here's how I think I'd like to design it. And then we can start talking about design issues and what you should know about how to get started in design. But it really has to start with the horticultural aspect of it. It's like a sculptor, and he said, I'm going to make a sculpture, and I couldn't get any marble, but I did get a big chunk of slate, and so I'm going to carve. I'm going to get my hammer and chisel out and carve this piece of slate, and the first wrapping, and then the big chunks slides off of it.
Yeah.
It's all in layers and it just crumbles, because they didn't know any better,
Right.
or whatever. And so it's the same thing. I always talk about bonsai as an art, and I always talk about bonsai people as being sculptors, and bonsai as being sculpture, except that the medium is living, as we all know. But a lot of people who are starting out don't differentiate them from houseplants. And so that's the horticultural aspect of it, to impress on them, okay, this is actually a tree. It's really not a house plant, and some people try to grow them that way. Some people do have success that way, but your odds of success are a lot better if you don't treat it like a house plant. So
for sure,
it's really great advice on that. Definitely horticulture first. We're nearing the end of our show here, but before we sign off, we'd like to talk about the bonsai word of the week. And me and Mike have chosen Tachiagari.
Tachiagari.
Tachiagari. One of the things here with our show is I'm the best at pronouncing things. So if you can't tell, but yeah, Tachiagari. And we're going to define the word, talk about it for a couple of minutes, and so everybody can learn some new bonsai terminology. I know you said earlier, don't worry too much about the terminology in bonsai, but it's one of the things we talk about here every week.
Sure, and it's good. And so many times the Japanese terms are just easier. They'll have one word instead of a dead branch that on which the bark has come off, and
right.
They've got three letters that say it, right? So,
yes.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So what is Tachiagari then? How do we define that?
Well, the area of the trunk between the root base and the first branch, typically. And so the question is, what's important about that? And the importance of the Tachiagari is, in the first place, it defines the style of the tree. Whether that is an erect vertical movement, whether it is a slanting movement, whether it already has a curve in it, whether it tapers well, So that distance is really, to me, it's what defines the style of the tree. As soon as if you're picking out a piece of material or whatever, if there's something in the ground and you're collecting, very possibly you don't see the rootage because there's a layer of duff or organic matter or debris or something on the ground around it. If you're in a nursery, it's in a pot and there's stuff around. You don't really see the root base at first. The first thing that you see is that trunk as it emerges from the earth until the branch structure begins, right? And so that's where you start. That's where you say, oh, I think I can use that. Or that looks interesting. I think this bears further inspection. So, and in terms of if you're judging an exhibit, for instance, the length of the Tachiagari has a lot to do with the balance of the tree. So for instance, balance has a lot of different characteristics, right? So one thing can be horizontal balance. We're balancing from left to right. Balance in Japanese, in the Japanese professionals, when you talk about balance, you're almost always talking about areas of density and whether they balance. But there's also balance between the bottom of the tree and the top of the tree. And so if the Tachiagari, let's say, is too tall and you end up having 1/2 trunk and 1/2 crown, sometimes that throws your proportion off a little bit. It can throw your balance off a little bit. So not only the thickness is related to age, the direction is related to the style of the tree, the length of it is related to balance of the tree. So in other words, that one piece, that one area is sort of what you focus on first.
Yeah, learning about the Tachiagari is something that has changed my perspective on approaching material to begin design on everything that I look at now. So I'm really glad that I had learned that word earlier on. But yeah, it definitely helps. But
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna wrap us up here right at the hour mark. But before we go, was there any closing statements you'd like to say, Dave? Or I know it went from Mr. David De Groot to Dave now. But before we let you go, is there any closing statements?
Well, if I get started, I'll just talk forever, so I shouldn't do that. But no, what I think is important is that you guys and many others are doing a fantastic job of educating the public, of putting information out there, both in terms of images and things that you have to say, information, things that, whether it's about technique, whether it's about leaning on the experience of other people, like something like this where you interview others. You're doing a job in educating the bonsai community and raising the quality of bonsai art. And so I guess the last thing I'd say is my hat's off to you guys.
Thank you, Dave.
I think you're
thank
doing
you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Great.
Take care.
Yeah, you too, Dave. Take care. Bye-bye, Dave.
Bye.